We moved into the house last month. A fixer-upper, the realtor called it, which was code for drafty windows, uneven floors, and a basement that smelled like old water and regret. But it was cheap, and after the chaos of the city, the quiet countryside seemed like a dream. For my wife and me, it was an opportunity to start fresh. For our 2-year-old daughter, Ellie, it was an adventure. Ellie had been enamored with the house from the moment we pulled into the overgrown driveway. She toddled through the hallways, her tiny hands running along the faded wallpaper, giggling at things I could not see. I chalked it up to her imagination. Kids that age find wonder in everything, even the mundane. But then, the giggles turned into conversations. At first, it was harmless babbling. I would hear her from the next room, chattering away in that sing-song tone toddlers use when they play. She would pause as if listening, then respond with a laugh or a soft, "Okay." I assumed she was imitating me and my wife, picking up our rhythm of speech. It was cute, really. Then one night, as I was tucking her into bed, Ellie turned to me and said, "The quiet lady likes my room." I froze, my hand still smoothing her blanket. "The quiet lady?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Ellie nodded, her curls bouncing. "She sits in the corner." I glanced at the corner. It was empty, just the pale glow of her nightlight, casting soft shadows on the wall. "What does she look like?" Ellie shrugged, as if the answer should have been obvious. "She's quiet." The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, so unconcerned, sent a shiver down my spine. I kissed her forehead, whispered goodnight, and turned off the light. But as I closed the door, I could not shake the feeling that we were not alone. Over the Ma. Next week, Ellie spoke more about the quiet lady. She described her as nice and pretty, though she could not tell me what color her hair was or the clothes she wore. "She doesn't look like that," Ellie would say, pointing to a picture of a cartoon princess. "She's different." At first, I dismissed it. Imaginary friends are normal, I told myself, a sign of creativity. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, that made my stomach twist. One night, while washing dishes, I heard Ellie laughing from the living room. "Stop it!" she giggled. "That tickles!" I dried my hands and peeked around the corner. She was sitting on the floor, her back to me, her little hands waving as if fending off an invisible attacker. "Ellie?" I called. She stopped and turned to look at me, her expression innocent and wide-eyed. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Playing," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "With who?" She pointed to the empty air beside. Her. The quiet lady. A chill crept up my neck. I forced a smile and said, "Well, tell her it's almost bedtime." Ellie nodded, then leaned toward the empty space and whispered, "You have to go now." I turned away quickly, unwilling, to watch for a reaction. That night, I woke to the sound of whispers, faint and unintelligible, like the hum of a distant radio. I sat up, my heart pounding, and strained to listen. They seemed to come from Ellie's room. I crept down the hallway, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. Her door was ajar, and through the crack, I could see her sitting up in bed, her silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of her nightlight. She was not alone. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with a silence that buzzed in my ears. Ellie was looking at the far corner of the room, her head tilted slightly as if listening. "Ellie?" I whispered. She turned to me, startled. "Daddy," she said, her voice small. "You scared her." "Who?" "The quiet lady." I stepped into the room and flipped on the light. The corner was empty, of course, nothing but a stuffed bear slumped against the wall. But Ellie's gaze lingered there, her eyes filled with something I could not name. Fear? Curiosity? I tried to shake it off. Kids have active imaginations, I told myself again. but the feeling of being watched lingered long after Ellie fell asleep. The next day, I decided to do some research. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, and I figured there might be some history to explain Ellie's strange behavior. A tragic fire, perhaps, or a previous owner with a colorful past. What I found was worse. In the archives of the local library, I stumbled across an article from 1973. A photograph of a smiling woman stared back at me, her face framed by long, dark hair. The caption read, "Local teacher found dead in home. Police suspect foul play. Her name was Margaret Colette, and she had lived in our house. According to the article, she had no family, no close friends. Just a quiet, solitary life that ended abruptly when neighbors reported hearing a scream. By the time police arrived, the house was silent." I stared at the grainy photo, my stomach churning. Ellie's words echoed in my head. "She's quiet." That night, as I tucked Ellie into bed, I asked her, "Does the quiet lady ever leave your room?" Ellie shook her head. "No, she stays here. She likes it here." I swallowed hard. "What does she do?" Ellie hesitated. "Sometimes she just looks at me." "Does she ever look at me?" Ellie's face lit up in a mischievous smile, the kind only toddlers can pull off. "No, silly, she doesn't like you." I laughed nervously, kissed her goodnight, and left the room. But her words stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. At 3:17 a.m., I woke to the sound of static. It was faint but unmistakable, the low hiss of white noise. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the baby monitor. I grabbed my phone and opened the monitor app. Ellie's room appeared on the screen, bathed in the pale green light of the night vision camera. She was sound asleep, her small body curled up under the blankets. But in the corner of the room, the static seemed to warp. The shadows flickered, forming the vague outline of something. Someone. And then it turned. Two eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto the camera, locked onto me. The static grew louder, drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat. The figure leaned forward, its face obscured but its intent unmistakable. It was whispering my name. I dropped the phone, the screen cracking against the floor. By the time I picked it up again, the monitor was silent, but I knew. The quiet lady was no longer in Ellie's room. She was here, with me. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows sent my nerves into overdrive. I checked on Ellie 3 times before sunrise. She was fine, sleeping peacefully as if the quiet lady were nothing more than a comforting presence. But for me, the air in the house felt wrong. It was as though the walls themselves were watching. I spent the next day in a haze, pretending everything was fine for Ellie's sake. My wife, blissfully unaware, went about her usual routine. I wanted to tell her what I had seen, what I had felt, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand? Ellie, meanwhile, seemed happier than ever. She played with her blocks, hummed to herself, and occasionally glanced toward empty spaces, smiling as if someone had made her laugh. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Stress, maybe, sleep deprivation. But every time Ellie glanced at those invisible corners, the hair on my arms stood on end. By the time night fell, I had made a decision. I couldn't live like this, feeling hunted in my own home. I told myself I'd stay up all night, watch the monitor, and confront whatever was happening. At 2 a.m., I sat in the living room, my phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. The baby monitor app was open, the green-lit image of Ellie's room filling the screen. She was asleep again, her soft breathing faintly audible. For the first hour, nothing happened. Just the usual creaks of the old house and the low hum of the heater. But then, just past 3 a.m., the static returned. It started softly. a faint hiss that made me lean closer to the screen. Ellie stirred in her sleep, her tiny body shifting under the blankets. Then, the shadows in the corner of the room began to move. I held my breath as the outline of the quiet lady emerged, her form flickering like an old VHS tape struggling to stay on track. She didn't look at Ellie. She was looking directly at the camera. I froze, my hands gripping the phone so tightly it felt like it might shatter. The quiet lady tilted her head, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. Her face was still obscured, but I could feel her eyes, two bottomless pits of nothing, boring into mine. She raised one hand and pointed, not at Ellie, but at me. And then she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, distorted and crackling like a damaged recording, but I could make out the words. "Come upstairs." My stomach twisted. I wanted to throw the phone, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The screen flickered, and for a moment her face became clear. It was the woman from the photograph, Margaret, Colette. The screen went black. I don't remember how I ended up in the basement. I only remember the cold, damp air biting at my skin and the faint sound of Ellie's voice echoing from above. "Daddy?" she called. "Why are you in the dark?" I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I hadn't even realized I was holding it. The basement was a labyrinth of old boxes, rusted tools, and forgotten furniture. The walls were cracked, water-stained, and covered in cobwebs. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, behind a stack of rotting wood, was a door I had never noticed before. It was small and unassuming, painted the same faded gray as the walls around it. But something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just that I'd never seen it. It was the way it seemed to hum, as if it were alive. I stepped closer, the flashlight beam trembling against the door's surface. "Don't!" The voice wasn't Ellie's, it wasn't my wife's, it was Margaret's. I turned, the light darting through the darkness, but the basement was empty. When I looked back at the door, it was open. The room beyond the door was impossibly large, far bigger than the dimensions of the basement should allow. It was dark except for a faint, flickering glow coming from a television set in the center of the space. I stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me. The TV buzzed with static, casting long, jittery shadows across the floor. I approached, it slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I got closer, the static began to clear. The screen flickered and an image appeared. Ellie sitting on the floor of her room, playing with her blocks. She was smiling, oblivious to the figure standing. Just behind her, it was the quiet lady. I screamed and lunged for the TV, my hands slamming against the screen. But the image didn't change. Ellie didn't react, and then the quiet lady turned. Her face filled the screen, her empty eyes staring into mine. Her lips moved, but the sound didn't come from the TV, it came from behind me. "You're too loud," she whispered, her voice curling around me like smoke. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just darkness. When I turned back to the TV, the screen was blank. I woke up on the floor of Ellie's room, the morning sunlight streaming through the curtains. Ellie was still asleep, her small body rising and falling with each breath. The corner of the room was empty. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But when I stood up, I noticed something on the baby monitor sitting on Ellie's dresser. The screen was cracked. The faint outline of Margaret Colette's face burned into the glass like a ghostly afterimage. I wanted to throw it away, to leave the house and never come back. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The quiet lady wasn't tied to the house. She was tied to us. And every night as I lie awake, I can feel her watching. She's always watching.